Hello and welcome to the opening episode of ASEAN's Rakhine Crisis, a two-part podcast series from ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, or APHR. I'm Oliver Slow. This series examines the response of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, to the ongoing crisis in Myanmar's Rakhine state, following the devastating military-led crackdown on the Rohingya population that began on the 25th of August 2017. The attacks saw thousands killed, women and girls raped, hundreds of homes and entire villages burned to the ground. As a result, more than 740,000 refugees, overwhelmingly Rohingya, fled into neighbouring Bangladesh. This series builds upon APHR's recent report, ASEAN's Rakhine Crisis, assessing the regional response to atrocities in Myanmar's Rakhine state, which was published in October 2020. You can read the report on our website, ASEANMP.org. This series is part of our new podcast channel, Advocate, by ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, and which also includes our recent four-part series, Parliamentarians at Risk. Please share, subscribe, and leave reviews wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Rakhine State, located in western Myanmar, is one of the poorest and most isolated parts of the country. Overlooking the Bay of Bengal and located close to the border with Bangladesh, Rakhine is home to a range of ethnic groups, but some of its largest populations are the mainly Buddhists Rakhine and the Muslim Rohingya. Brights Islam is a Rohingya and was born in Sittwe, the Rakhine State capital. In 2012, however, as communal violence swept through the state, he and his family were confined in what were supposedly temporary internally displaced persons camps in Sittwe's outskirts, with more than 100,000 others. 8 years later, these camps remain, with most people unable to leave or unable to access education, healthcare or livelihood.
Now it is more than 80 years these people have been stuck here in like an open prison in the camps. But believe me that for myself, as a young man being in the camps is life like a hell for me. And I believe this is the same life for everyone out here in the camps. It's like when I say it, it's like more than an open prison. It's like, in a prison, the prisoner know how many years or how many days he have or she has to stay in the prison, because there's a sentence, of the period of the imprisonment. But now for us, we don't know how many years we have to keep staying here in the camps where there's no good educations, where nothing is good here.
Charles Santiago, a Malaysian Member of Parliament and APHR's chair, said the conditions the Rohingya are currently living under in Rakhine State are, quote, an apartheid.
We've never heard of the word apartheid in quite some time. It was largely used in the context of South Africa many years ago. We have not heard that word in recent times, but now the word seems very applicable to the situation in Rakhine State involving the Rohingyas. We are again environment in a 21st century environment using the word apartheid to categorize what is happening with the Rohingyas in Rakhine State as well as in the refugee camps, which I think has got almost 1 million people by now.
The oppression of the Rohingya at the hands of the Myanmar state goes back several decades. In the late 1970s, about 200,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh following a violent military operation aimed at rooting out so-called illegal immigrants. Another large-scale exodus occurred in the early 1990s, when 250,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh amid another army crackdown. Many of the Rohingya who fled these operations eventually returned to Rakhine, although some remained in Bangladesh. In June and October 2012, waves of violence erupted across Rakhine State between the predominantly Buddhist Rakhine and the Rohingya and other Muslim groups, following the rape and murder of a Rakhine woman by Muslim men and a retaliatory murder of 10 Muslim men a few days later. The rounds of violence left scores of people from all communities killed and hundreds of homes burned to the ground. About 140,000 people, the vast majority Rohingya, were displaced from their homes and corralled into camps, like the ones Bright Islam is living in.
At the moment, people have no hope to go to their home, because it was the question that people was interested when they were forcibly displaced here. As you know, maybe it was the questions to ask around 2012 or 13, 14, because there was people recently displaced, But now, what people understand is like they have to stay here.
The plight of the Rohingya deteriorated significantly after the 2012 violence. Myanmar tightened restrictions on movement and heavily limited their access to essential services such as healthcare, education, and livelihoods, as well as their rights to exercise their fundamental freedoms, including religion and belief, association, expression, and peaceful assembly. These state-imposed restrictions have effectively established an apartheid system that segregates the Rohingya from the rest of Myanmar. The appalling conditions in Rakhine State led to tens of thousands of Rohingya fleeing the country, with many boarding rickety boats to risk their lives and reach Malaysia, Indonesia, or other countries. Their plight attracted international headlines in mid-2015 when Thai authorities uncovered the graves of dozens of Rohingya and Bangladeshis at the border with Malaysia. The sites were believed to have been used as camps by human traffickers.
The Secretary General is concerned about the crisis evolving in the Andaman Sea and Straits of Malacca, where several thousand people are believed to be stranded on smugglers' boats. He is alarmed by reports that some countries may be refusing entry to boats carrying refugees and migrants. The Secretary General urges governments to ensure that the obligations of rescue at sea is upheld and the prohibition of refoulement is maintained. He also urges governments to facilitate timely disembarkation and keep their borders and ports open in order to help the vulnerable people who are in need.
The grim discovery prompted governments in the region to announce a crackdown on human trafficking. However, unable to unload their human cargo, traffickers abandoned the boats, leaving hundreds of desperate refugees adrift in the Andaman Sea and the Straits of Malacca for months, with limited food, water and fuel. When the boats began to drift into territorial waters, Thai, Malaysian and Indonesian authorities initially refused to allow those on board to disembark, and instead pushed them back to sea, in violation of the principle of non-refoulement, as well as international obligations to assist boats in distress. When they were eventually allowed to come to shore, the victims were severely malnourished and spoke of their horrific experiences at sea, where they were beaten, verbally abused, and often held to ransom. Estimates by UNHCR, the United Nations refugee body, said that between 2012 and 2015, around 112,500 Rohingya travelled by boat across the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. An unknown number died at sea. These perilous journeys continue today. So far in 2020, an estimated 2,000 refugees are believed to have attempted journeys from Bangladesh across the Bay of Bengal. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, governments in Southeast Asia have once again refused to allow refugees to disembark in violation of their international obligations. When the National League for Democracy, headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, came to power following a landslide election victory in November 2015, there was widespread hope that the situation for the Rohingya would drastically improve. In August 2016, Aung San Suu Kyi announced the establishment of the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State, headed by former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, tasked with finding solutions to the crisis in the state. The commission, which was made up of 3 international and 6 national members, was asked to present a report on its findings and recommendations in August 2017. Then in early October 2016, an armed Rohingya group, first calling itself Haraka al-Yaqin, then later changing its name to the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, or ARSA, attacked 3 police outposts in northern Rakhine, killing 9 police officers and wounding others.
The army started raiding villages after 9 policemen were killed in attacks on border posts. The government says 30 people died in fighting between security forces and an unidentified armed group. Shortly after the attacks on border police, this video of a group armed Rohingya appeared online. The government says they are foreign-trained terrorists. Rohingya leaders say they are frustrated local people.
Myanmar's security forces responded by launching so-called clearance operations, ostensibly to apprehend the ARSA fighters and recover stolen weapons. In reality, however, they were an indiscriminate attack on the Rohingya community of northern Rakhine. Security forces, including the military and the border guard police, conducted killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, torture and ill-treatment, rape and sexual violence, and destroyed homes and properties. An estimated 87,000 people, mainly Rohingya, fled to Bangladesh. In March 2017, the UN Human Rights Council established a fact-finding mission to investigate allegations of crimes against humanity in the country, including in Rakhine State. The situation remained grave throughout 2017. Humanitarian access to northern Rakhine State was severely restricted, and Rohingya men and boys were routinely arbitrarily arrested and tortured. On the 24th of August 2017, the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State published its final report, which included wide-ranging recommendations to restore freedom of movement, ensure equal access to healthcare, education and livelihood opportunities for all communities in the state, as well as a call for the government to review the controversial 1982 citizenship law, which denies the Rohingya legal identity.
We also stress that security operations must not impede humanitarian access to the population.
Letitia van den Assem, a member of the Commission, said that its final report speaks of two underlying narratives in Rakhine State.
First is the conflicted relationship between the people of Rakhine and the central government, the union government. And the second is about the troubled relations between the ethnic Rakhine and the Rohingya communities. There is no quick fix for these problems.
She added that there are currently three crises in Rakhine State.
A crisis of development, a crisis of human rights, and a crisis of security.
Just hours after the Commission's report was published, however, ARSA fighters launched coordinated attacks on an estimated 30 security outposts in northern Rakhine State. What came next has been extensively documented by the UN, human rights groups and the media. The Myanmar security forces launched a devastating attack on the entire Rohingya community of northern Rakhine, killing about 10,000 people, raping hundreds of women, and burning homes and in some areas entire villages to the ground. The violence forced more than 740,000 people to flee to neighbouring Bangladesh, joining hundreds of thousands who had escaped earlier waves of violence.
But there are so many traumatised people here, all trying to wake from their nightmares. They've seen their families drown or butchered, their villages razed to the ground, and their women and girls preyed on by predators in uniform.
In a report published in September 2018, the UN fact-finding mission called for Myanmar senior military officials to be investigated for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of genocide in relation to the attacks. The Myanmar government has denied allegations of human rights violations and initially claimed that the Rohingya had burned down their own homes. In September 2017, Aung San Suu Kyi conducted a speech in the Myanmar capital, Naypyidaw.
The government is working to restore the situation to normalcy. Since the 5th of September, there have been no armed clashes and there have been no clearance operations. Nevertheless, we are concerned to hear that numbers of Muslims are fleeing across the border to Bangladesh. We want to find out why this exodus is happening. We would like to talk to those who have fled as well as to those who have stayed.
As international outcry about the atrocities intensified, the government established mechanisms and bodies of its own, which have faced considerable criticism. They include the Union Enterprise for Humanitarian Assistance, Resettlement and Development in Rakhine, or UEHRD, which works with the private sector and other actors to coordinate relief and resettlement efforts and conduct development work in Rakhine State. The UEHRD has been accused of confiscating land that belonged to the Rohingya before they were forced to flee. Myanmar's government has also signed agreements for the repatriation of refugees with Bangladesh, as well as with UN agencies. But very few have actually returned, saying the situation in Rakhine State is not safe for them to do so. The Myanmar government has also attempted to counter international calls for accountability. In May 2018, it announced the establishment of an Independent Commission of Inquiry, or ICOE, which was mandated to investigate allegations of human rights violations and abuses in Rakhine State on the 25th of August 2017. From the outset, however, there were serious concerns about the Commission's independence, impartiality, and the ability of its members to investigate such serious crimes. The ICOE submitted its report to the President of Myanmar on the 20th of January 2020, and although it surprised many by admitting to serious violations, including possible war crimes, the Commission categorically denied there was genocidal intent and made no reference to rape and other crimes of sexual violence, which have been extensively documented by the UN rights groups and the media. Myanmar authorities refused to cooperate with the Independent Investigative Mechanism on Myanmar, which was established in September 2018 by the United Nations, and tasked with collecting and preserving evidence of serious crimes and preparing case files for criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court, or ICC, has opened an investigation into crimes against the Rohingya after the court ruled that a jurisdiction over crimes where at least one element took place on the territory of Bangladesh, which is a state party to the Rome Statute, the treaty that established the ICC. The investigation is ongoing. Then in November 2019, the Gambia filed a complaint at the International Court of Justice, or ICJ, where it accused Myanmar breaching its obligations as a state party to the UN Genocide Convention. In December 2019, Myanmar's State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi travelled to The Hague in the Netherlands, where she laid out her country's defence against the charges.
Regrettably, the Gambia has placed before the court an incomplete and misleading factual picture of the situation in Rakhine State in Myanmar. Yet, it is of the utmost importance that the court assess the situation obtaining on the ground in Rakhine dispassionately and accurately. The situation in Rakhine is complex and not easy to fathom.
On the 23rd of January 2020, the ICJ granted the Gambia's request and ordered Myanmar to take immediate action to protect the Rohingya from acts of genocide, to preserve evidence of crimes and to provide reports on the implementation of the measures until the case is completed. It is likely to take several years. Since the order, the Myanmar government has made several token efforts to show its compliance, but the situation for the Rohingya who are still in Myanmar remains perilous. Here's Laura Haig, a human rights researcher.
This was an order from one of the highest courts in the world, and Myanmar is not doing anything to implement that order. They're continuing with the same policies of discrimination, of persecution. Yes, they've maybe issued one or two presidential orders telling people not to propagate hate speech, but without any enforcement on the ground, that really means nothing. I think what's striking about the situation for the Rohingya at the moment in Rakhine State is that nothing has really changed in the 3+ years since the military's genocidal campaign against them.
Haig said the abuses of the Myanmar military in 2016 and 17 have been widely discussed, but that less attention had been given to the conditions the Rohingya have faced in Myanmar for many years.
Which actually continues today in the form of the complete denial of their rights, whether it's their right to citizenship, to a nationality, their right to freely move around, travel between villages within Rakhine State to other parts of the country, and then through those restrictions being able to access schools, hospitals for education and healthcare, going to fields, markets, things that people would rely on for their livelihood. A lot of that architecture of persecution remains in place.
The crisis in Rakhine State was plunged even further into chaos in January 2019, when forces from the Arakan Army, or AA, an ethnic Rakhine-led armed group, launched attacks on security posts in the state. Since then, human rights groups have reported indiscriminate artillery attacks, often killing or injuring civilians, torture and ill treatment, deaths in custody, and displacement of civilians. Thomas Keane, editor-in-chief of Frontier Myanmar magazine and a consultant on Myanmar for the International Crisis Group, told APHR that the conflict had hardly subsided since early 2019.
And the results are there for everyone to see. You've got, according to civil society groups, more than 200,000 ethnic Rakhine people have been displaced. Less than half of those are in recognized IDP camps. There's also been a very high civilian death toll, particularly this year. You've got a lot of factors that point to increasing conflicts, and the economic and social impacts of the conflict have been very severe already and seem like they're only going to get worse.
As of early October 2020, the UN estimates that almost 100,000 people have been displaced by the conflict. However, getting accurate information about the situation in Rakhine State is extremely challenging, and was exacerbated in June 2019 when authorities suspended mobile internet services to 9 conflict-affected townships in Rakhine and neighbouring Chin states, denying people access to information and hampering the provision of humanitarian aid. At the time of recording, 2G services have resumed, although sources say that services are intermittent and connections are poor. There's also been a major outbreak of COVID-19 in Myanmar since mid-August 2020, including in Rakhine State. The government has responded by putting in place several measures. Those living in all townships in Rakhine State are subject to stay-at-home orders, while an evening curfew is also in effect. While all communities are at risk, there are concerns for the well-being of already vulnerable populations, in particular the tens of thousands of civilians displaced by fighting between the military and the AA, as well as the Rohingya and other Muslims detained in camps since 2012. Brights Islam, the Rohingya living in the IDP camp on the outskirts of Sitwe, said the situation had grown worse since the second wave of the pandemic started in August.
The situation, particularly healthcare and food and employment, have get worse for the people, so that the people have struggled more for food now. I would say since the COVID second wave outbreak in Sitwe, the hospitals in the rural area have been closed. So people have nowhere to go for free treatment. And then at the moment, there's no job opportunities because they are stay-home orders and the other preventive measurements, terrible situations, so they don't have enough income.
On the 8th of November, Myanmar held a general election. At the time of recording, the NLD looked to be on course for a resounding victory, particularly in the country's centre. The vote, however, fell chronically short of international standards for a free and fair election. Issues raised include discriminatory citizenship laws that prohibit the participation of ethnic and religious minorities, including the Rohingya, ongoing conflict and displacement in border areas, a continued crackdown on freedom of expression, as well as the fact that the vote was held under the military-drafted 2008 constitution, which guarantees the military a prominent role in Myanmar's politics. In mid-October, the Union Election Commission announced the cancellation as whole or in part in at least 56 townships in Shan, Kachin, Kayin, Rakhine, Chin and Mon states, as well as Bago region, citing security concerns. The cancellations in Rakhine were due to the Arakan army conflict, but the news brought widespread anger, especially among Rakhine people. Notably, voting was largely cancelled in townships held by the Arakan National Party, while those held by the National League for Democracy emerged relatively unscathed. Chor San Laing, founding member of the Institute for Peace and Governance, a Rakhine civil society group, said the decision had angered many Rakhine people.
More than 70% of Rakhine population didn't have a chance to vote in this election, and also they didn't have a chance to choose their representatives. I may say that the USA had been cast the ones or the Rakhine people, not only Rakhine people, but also the Rohingya. But Rakhine people, especially more to activate, said it's not fair and free election. And also, if the government didn't recognize our voting rights, they said we won't recognize the government, especially this government.
Thomas Keane from Frontier and the ICG said the decision to cancel voting in the state contributed to widespread distrust among Rakhine people of the political system. He also pointed to the case of prominent Rakhine politician U A Mong, who in early 2019 was sentenced to 20 years in prison for high treason. He was arrested in January 2018, around the time of violent clashes in Brau U in central Rakhine State, where several Rakhine people were killed by security forces.
You put yourself in the shoes of a Rakhine voter. They've seen for 2 elections, really, their party be very successful and have almost no power after elections. And then also the leading political figure in the state has been arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Demonstrations have been violently put down by security forces. I mean, you don't have to be very clever to work out that is, when you have an insurgency that's already brewing, it's going to kind of give it further momentum. There's been no real effort at de-escalation. It's all been escalation. That's the kind of vicious cycle that we've got ourselves into in Rakhine.
Clearly, the situation in Rakhine State today is dour. 3 years after the military's brutal operations, there's been no change for the estimated 600,000 Rohingya still in Rakhine, who remain deprived of their rights to a nationality and citizenship, freedom of movement, and access to essential services. Attempts at repatriation have stalled, while the authorities are pushing ahead with a deeply problematic citizenship verification process in which the Rohingya are required to apply to be verified as citizens. This verification process has been accompanied by reports of threats, intimidation, coercion, and at times physical violence. Myanmar authorities have also taken several steps that appear designed to cement the expulsion of the Rohingya from the country, bulldozing villages and building new structures and security forces bases instead. Some former Rohingya villages are also being removed from official maps, literally erasing Rohingya's existence and history. The UN fact-finding mission has warned that the Rohingya and Rakhine state remain, quote, at ongoing risk of genocide. On top of all of this is the ongoing conflict between the AA and the Myanmar military, which has displaced thousands and added another layer of tension to an already complex and deeply troubled state. The decision to cancel voting in many townships of Rakhine state would have done nothing to fix the deep-rooted distrust many Rakhine people feel towards Myanmar's central government. And yet, despite the international attention and outcry of the last 3 years, Myanmar's authorities have failed to take meaningful steps to address the situation in Rakhine. Whether by building trust between communities, restoring the rights of the Rohingya, creating conditions conducive for their return, or ensuring accountability for the atrocities. On the contrary, in many areas, officials appear to be exacerbating the situation, entrenching discrimination and segregation, while whitewashing military crimes. Efforts that have been taken have been largely tokenistic, and appear designed to appease international pressure rather than addressing the root causes of the crisis. So who can step up? A crucial partner of all of this is ASEAN, the regional body that Myanmar joined in 1997. In the second part of this series, released tomorrow, we'll be assessing the role the 10-member bloc has played until this point, and what more it can do to play an important and positive role in contributing to and promoting lasting solutions for all communities in Rakhine State. This episode of ASEAN's Rakhine Crisis podcast series was written and produced by me, Oliver Slow, with editorial input from Elise T.A. Dagusset. APHR's work is supported by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA, the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Open Societies Foundation. This series is part of APHR's new podcast channel, Advocate, which addresses some of the most important human rights development in Southeast Asia. For more information about APHR's work, please visit our website, aseanmp.org. Thanks for listening.